All right. Hello, everybody. Teacher Dave here, bringing you my summative assignment for UCCS class 5203, Psychology of the Gifted. Today, I'm going to talk about ways to talk to parents about their gifted child or possibly their non-gifted child. I plan to cover a number of topics, including definitions of giftedness, possible testing methods, some academic needs of gifted kids, some misconceptions about gifted kids, some of the decisions that will need to be made for gifted kids, like how to accelerate their curriculum, or should they skip a grade or more? Should they start kindergarten early, and so forth. I will talk about how to address social considerations parents may be concerned about, and some of the more challenging psychological concerns parents may face with gifted kids, like underachievement in gifted kids, overexcitability, and dealing with emotional intensity. Each one of these topics could easily be its own conversation. So, in order to keep this talk from running 100 hours, I'm going to touch on topics and offer some suggestions of references I know to be worth checking into. That way, you can look for more specific and detailed information from the experts and researchers themselves in the particular area in which you want more support. Now, before I even begin talking about giftedness, I'm going to start with the suggestion I've found it helpful to keep in mind during pretty much every parent conference I've ever been in. And that is that most parents, the overwhelming majority, are really just trying to do the best they can for their kids. Over the course of your career, you may encounter a very few folks who have absolutely no concern for their children's best interests, or who may be directly harmful to their children. You may find yourself in the awful, horrible, but necessary position of reporting parents to protective services. But by and large, most parents are simply out to do the best they can for their kids. And what parents sometimes view as best may leave us downright stupefied. Fair enough. But most parents are simply trying to do the best they can for their kids. I have found this helpful to keep in mind during parent conferences. You may want to write it on your arm or something so that you can keep looking at it. So, giftedness. What is giftedness? The National Association for Gifted Children has a pretty good definition of gifted, and something like 47 states have their own definition as well. You can find these on the NAGC's website in their State of the States report. Basically, giftedness in children has to do with a child performing higher in one or more areas than their same age peers. This can be in general intellectual ability, usually defined by an IQ above 135, or students can be gifted in specific academic domains like math, language arts, science, or in creative areas such as the visual arts, music, or the performing arts. Then natural-born athletes are psychomotor gifted. So these, high-performing dancers, track stars, swimmers, other sports stars, these are psychomotor gifted folks. And then finally, many states identify an area of leadership giftedness. Now, I might as well touch on this here. I've never, ever seen a student identified solely as gifted in leadership, nor have I ever seen specific programming only for gifted leaders, though I do think it is vital that leadership skills be directly taught. So, debate classes, collaborative processes and group work, communication skills, all of these can and should be taught to students who exhibit natural gifts in leading others, those who other students naturally seem to follow. The book Leadership Education, Developing Skills in Youth by William Richardson and John Feldhusen is a great resource. It can be hard to find. There are many others, but I haven't personally vetted them. Back to identifying gifted kids. So, definitions of giftedness. Parents will want to know how gifted students are identified. IQ is often assessed by tests like the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, often called the WISC, or the Stanford-Binet test. Unfortunately, most current IQ tests don't provide scores higher than 150. So identifying highly gifted children can be really problematic. Unfortunately, children with exceptionally high IQs have very specific schooling needs, so they really must be identified. For example, specific schooling needs, very high IQ children can have an emotional maturity that can be far beyond their physical maturity, and it can be far beyond their age. So, meeting the needs of highly gifted students can be really challenging, but identifying them can also be challenging. We'll talk more about all that when we discuss acceleration. So, other than IQ, how are gifted children identified? Again, giftedness tends to be evidenced by abilities beyond those of the student's same age peers. For example, I was teaching a second grade class, and there was a diner nearby, which was really popular with the popular students. One day, during an indoor recess, a few of my students drew the diner. So this is pretty much artwork I expect from 7 and 8-year-olds. I view this as typical of what I've seen over the years teaching this age student. Another student who had never been to the diner drew this: the dinner at Sam's Deli Diner. This is not art I typically expect from a young 8-year-old. So some giftedness stands out. But what about giftedness that may not be so obvious? How do we identify this? This may be a surprise, but statistically, teacher recommendations are not a very effective way of identifying gifted students. Sorry. Far too often, our biases lead us to choose compliant over curious. So anyone ever worked with a student who just drove you crazy in very creative, possibly diabolical, clever ways? Maybe they were gifted, possibly a budding criminal mastermind. These are the students we can't afford to miss. Interestingly, to me, parent recommendations are much more effective. And there are a number of assessments also which, too many, in fact, which can be used to identify gifted kids. Unfortunately, many of the most common tests used tend to be culturally biased. So teachers, if you're working in schools with culturally and linguistically diverse populations, you'll need to be extra vigilant in putting aside your biases and looking for signs of giftedness. One challenge that can come with this particular demographic, CLD students, is often, surprisingly to me, this demographic of parents and students may actually be reluctant to consider gifted programming. Oftentimes, they're afraid of losing their own culture. They can be afraid of whitening their children. It is remarkably important to consider student culture when designing gifted programming. I can't say that enough. I'm going to say it again. It is remarkably important to consider student culture when designing gifted programming. Showing parents that schools will honor and support students' native cultures and diversity can go a long way in gaining parental support. This will also help students experience and learn about each other's cultures. Win-win. There are some great books on this topic: Identifying and Serving Diverse Gifted Learners, Meeting the Needs of Special Population in Gifted Education. This is by Jamie Castellano and Kimberly Chandler. And Special Populations in Gifted Education, Understanding Our Most Able Students from Diverse Backgrounds, also by Jamie Castellano, this time with Andrea Dawn Frazier. These are great resources for finding and working with gifted students from special and marginalized populations. Speaking of special populations, I'm going to interject here that students can be gifted and have a disability. These are known as twice exceptional students, or 2E students, and they can sometimes be difficult to identify. A few examples of 2E people you may have heard of. Henry Winkler is a highly gifted performer who has benefited countless people by sharing his struggles with dyslexia. Growing up, he was my hero as the Fonz. Now he's my hero as himself. Pablo Picasso was also dyslexic. Beethoven went deaf. Noted physicist Stephen Hawking became paralyzed due to ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Conversation with the parents of 2E students may best be conducted along with the student special ed case manager or specialists in the area of the child's disability, which may also be you. So, one of the most important aspects to keep in mind is that parents of students with disabilities often go through stages of grief in a similar way that parents who have lost a child do. And what almost no one ever mentions about the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, is that the stages are not purely linear. People can be depressed one day, angry the next, accepting one day, denying the next. The way parents speak to you in a meeting about their 2E child may have nothing to do with you, probably has nothing to do with you. Rick Lavoie's fantastic workshop videos, How Difficult Can This Be? The Fat City Workshop, and first one picked on, Learning Disabilities and Social Skills, should be required viewing for all teachers, I believe. These are designed primarily for anyone who works with students with learning disabilities, but also can help when being mindful of gifted students who may struggle with social skills concerns. If you are talking with parents whose child has been identified as gifted, there are decisions to be made. And if not, you're probably talking to upset parents that are wondering how their Wunderkind has been overlooked. Let's go ahead and clear that up now. One area I've seen parents get strongly upset about is when their kids were not identified as GT. As we will discuss, parent referrals can be really helpful for identifying gifted students. But sometimes it does seem like all parents think their kids are the smartest child ever. Once assessments have been done, if a student really will not benefit from gifted programming and the parents are insisting on it, possibly angrily, this may be a difficult conversation to have. There are a number of times when having a school administrator in the meeting is a good idea, and this is one of them. But there are some points to make that you can make to parents who feel like their child should be identified and they're not. And those depend somewhat upon why the parent is so vehement that their child is gifted. This will definitely affect the course of the conversation. For example, is the parent afraid the student will miss out on academic opportunities because the student masters content very easily and is being held back by the current pace of the class? Or does the student really exhibit characteristics of giftedness like abounding curiosity or highly clever expressions of thought which may be shown in unconventional ways? Okay, if so, possibly the student should be reassessed or assessed with different testing instruments. Was the testing given culturally appropriate or was it comprehensive? There may be a case where the student needs to be reassessed. But, and this is often the case, is the parent afraid the child will miss out on advanced classes that will set up their future for AP classes and an Ivy League college? If so, gifted programming for a student who is not ready for it can be a huge detriment. You might want to remind parents that a 2.5 GPA in AP classes really won't benefit them like a 3.8 GPA in traditional classes will. Also, studies have shown that apart from a few very specific fields, graduating toward the top of a class of a smaller college actually looks much better to prospective employers than graduating in the middle or the bottom of a prestigious school. Yes, employers may be impressed by the college name at first, but once they look more closely, A high GPA and impressive work ethic will almost always outweigh the fact that a person merely did okay in a more well-known school. Also, ask, are the parents really willing to pay for their child to end up in a lower tier of a higher price school? Will that really offer a higher lifelong return on investment than graduating with a better GPA from a lower price state school? These can be good points to help, these can be good points to make to help mollify parents whose kids just are not gifted, but who dearly want them to be. New York Times columnist, Frank Bruni wrote about this in his book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, an antidote to the college admissions mania. I recommend that. Sometimes parents are worried that if their child is not gifted, then they will be judged by their social circle as failures. Usually this is more common among affluent circles, among parents with higher income jobs like lawyers, doctors, tech industry folks, bankers, etc. There are sometimes genetic components of giftedness, so it can be natural for gifted parents to expect to have gifted kids, and they can feel like failures if they don't. But sometimes parents just want their kids to be gifted because all of their friends' kids are in gifted programs and they feel like it is the school or teacher's fault if their kids are not. This can be challenging to overcome. In schools with affluent families, it is common for parents to walk in with a large packet from their pediatrician and independent testing firms showing results that don't match up with the classroom reality. Now, I'm not suggesting that any clinician anywhere is willing to provide a false diagnosis for parents with money. But when parents pay several thousands of dollars for independent testing, some firms feel a pressure to look closely for what the parents want to see. I've personally seen this happen on a number of occasions. Maybe it never happens anymore. That would be awesome. In any case, sometimes a school may need to have their own data to support the placement of a student in a more appropriate general ed setting, in spite of parent demands. Again, this is a meeting that school or district administrators should probably attend, or at the very least, multiple teachers who work with the student. It can help to make sure some of the school faculty are sitting on the same side of the table as the parents. This can help the parents keep from feeling ganged up on. An example of this. I recently taught a student, a senior in high school, whose father met with me repeatedly to bring up his son's grades because his son's dream was to attend a particular college. Obvious to me was that this was the father's dream that the son attend this prestigious school, not the son's. The son's dream was to get through high school with as little academic exertion as possible, while still maintaining the eligibility to play sports. The son's nightmare was to do the work required to get into the dad's dream school. The father scheduled numerous meetings with me, kept me almost an hour late after a parent-teacher night to express the reasons why his son should have better grades in class than he actually did. Actually, what the dad did was expressed one reason over and over, and that reason had nothing to do with his son's actual ability or effort on classwork. It was entirely based upon the father's dream school. Sound familiar? I repeated as gently, but as firmly as I could, that his son never came to ask for extra help, never attended my class during study hall, never asked to meet after school or during lunch for extra help, and put forth the bare minimum effort required to pass, if that. His son was not a gifted student and, frankly, was unmotivated to follow his father's passion. Attending that prestigious school would almost certainly have been a very expensive mistake. This fell on deaf ears. I certainly kept teaching the content. I kept checking in with the student. I offered extra support, which he never took advantage of. So, back to the decisions parents and teachers will need to make for students who have been identified as gifted. Most of these decisions are primarily related to students whose giftedness is predominantly academic. Students with really high general intellectual ability or those who excel in a particular academic domain may need a different placement. Students who need an accelerated curriculum may need a placement in a higher grade level, different classes, whereas highly creative and psychomotor gifted students can often be supported among their same age peers. So, how do we accelerate learning for gifted students? This conversation with parents may be the most difficult of all because these decisions can be really hard to undo. Do we have gifted students begin kindergarten early? Do we have gifted students skip a grade or more? Do we have or create a gifted pull-out program? Can we offer an accelerated curriculum for gifted students in class with their similar age peers, some sort of telescoping? And does any of those support their emotional maturity? The answer to these questions will depend on many factors, including the programming available in the school or district, the support of teachers in the school, because some can be very resistant to grade skipping or beginning school early. Then there's the child's area or areas of giftedness. And most importantly, there's the child themselves. Ultimately, the best methods of accelerating learning for a student will come down to the individual student. What is best for one will not be best for another. This can present a challenge in the standardized classroom, especially in schools and districts that give all of their emphasis and resources to bringing low-performing students up to average at the expense of programming for students at the other end of the spectrum. Unfortunately, these do exist. Important in the decision about how to accelerate curriculum is the child's socialization. If they stay with their same age peers, will the gifted child have anyone on their emotional or intellectual level to talk to? If they advance grade levels, how will the child fit in? Gifted students are often more socially mature than their peers, but not always. There are highly confident gifted students, and there are students who feel embarrassed by their abilities. It is important to remember that one of the common traits in the definition of gifted is that these children are able to learn, work, or perform at a level higher than their same age peers. In almost any school setting, being different from others is uncomfortable. Conversations with parents about their child's social needs should be conducted along with the school or district's gifted coordinator or a counselor, hopefully who has expertise in working with gifted students and preferably who knows the student. All methods of accelerating gifted students come with pros and cons. I personally taught a 6-year-old boy in my second grade classroom. He actually turned 6 5 days after second grade started, eligible for kindergarten age-wise. Academically, he was a great fit. Socially and physically, he had significant challenges all year and the year after that. He was much smaller than the other boys, and he spent every recess alone. He was never picked for teams. As a grade level, all 4 teachers designed group activities. We attempted to encourage socialization, but it didn't help. He was always accepted, but never sought out. Another time, I ran an interest-based committee of 15 gifted students from 5 different grade levels, kindergarten through 4th grade. These students met weekly to design, plan, and acquire a large aquarium on behalf of the school. Despite the differences in age, these students collaborated and worked well together, but they didn't go hang out with each other on the weekends. I did ask. They waved to each other in the hall. They were, very cordial with each other, but they didn't go spend all their time together. This program, this group was successful because these students met weekly, but were mainly around their same age peers. Children's developmental levels change so quickly that accelerating students by skipping grades or starting school early can be really difficult. Administratively, this can be much easier for the school, but it can be very difficult on the student. Some older studies, like A Nation Deceived, How Schools Hold Back America's Brightest Students from 2004 show that acceleration works great, and that is what you'll find on NAGC's website. But every one of the numerous experiences I have with grade skipping and starting kindergarten early were a case of it was okay, but there was no other choice. Or I wouldn't do it again. I've heard that. Parents need to be aware of potential challenges prior to making this decision because, again, it can be hard to undo. Information about the benefits of acceleration and types of acceleration, including grade skipping and telescoping, can be found on the website of the National Association for Gifted Children at www.nagc.org or on the Davidson Institute website at www.davidsongifted.org. It's a great website. A common misconception for parents and teachers is that their gifted children need only work on areas where they are not as strong because their areas of giftedness will work themselves out. This actually seems to be how educational decisions are made these days. They're fine in blank, so we need to focus on blank. What if Albert Einstein had only studied reading and writing because he was already just fine in math? He was a late reader. In today's education system, I believe Albert Einstein would have spent almost his entire education, at least his early education, in remedial reading classes, not in math classes. What if Mark Twain had focused on physics? Children need to be challenged in their area of giftedness in order to develop their greatest abilities as fully as possible. Often, children will explore their area of giftedness purely out of interest, like the child who dances all the time, or the child who draws constantly, or the child who spends their summer watching TED Talks and YouTube videos on physics lessons. I taught that one 2 years ago. These children still need direct instruction to develop their full potential. Venus and Serena Williams spent years practicing tennis. So did Billie Jean King. Langston Hughes wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. They had direct instruction. They didn't just depend on their natural gifting. Another common misconception among parents and teachers is that gifted children explore more deeply by showing mastery of content in multiple ways. For example, okay, now use these same vocabulary words you already know in a story. Or after solving the odd-numbered problems on this page, gifted students write 5 more problems using the same formula. One thing I've heard over and over from gifted students is they didn't want to be in a gifted program because it simply meant more work, not more interesting work. Once a gifted child has mastered the content, they should be allowed to move on, not repeat showing mastery. This is often a pitfall of extension activities, especially those found in basal textbooks. Again, resources on telescoping curricula can be really helpful here. What conversations do we have with parents of gifted students who just won't work in class? If they have paid any attention at all, they can answer every question the teacher asks. Often, they can answer without even having paid attention, but they won't try. They don't turn in work. They may not bother answering on tests, and they are failing. In high school, I had a friend who was charismatic, like superstar charismatic. He was also really, really smart. Lucky sucker. On every test, which used a Scantron, he created the most clever patterns of dots, which, when viewed from a distance, became an image of a dog or a face or something. This was true and was in the late 1980s, long before the Peanuts movie came out. To my knowledge, this strategy never got him a perfect score, as happened in the movie. When I met him, he was on his second trip through senior year, and his outlook for graduating wasn't very promising. So what do we do with the gifted underachievers? How do we explain to parents that, the public education system just isn't working for your kid? Well, first, we need to find out why. Excuse me. Are they just bored? Do they need to find some area of interest and let them explore to their heart's content, finding ways to assess their mastery of the content along the way? Do we change the content entirely because they already know everything? Did they miss content, or are they confused and are using being bored as an excuse? Yes, this can happen to gifted kids too, particularly those whose minds tend to wander. We're going to talk about some of the dreamers in the overexcitability conversation of this, but did they miss content and are saying they're bored because they don't know what's going on? This can happen. Is it possible that these underachievers have been beaten down by always knowing the answer and having a teacher ask the class, please, does anybody but, insert the child's name here, know the answer? Anyone else? Gifted students underperform for a variety of reasons. Dr. Jim Delisle has an excellent book, Doing Poorly on Purpose, Strategies to Reverse Underachievement and Respect Student Dignity. His similarly named YouTube video, Doing Poorly on Purpose, Underachievement and the Quest for Dignity, is a great introduction. Another excellent resource regarding underachievement is Joanne Whitmore's book, Giftedness, Conflict, and Underachievement. Whatever the reasons underlying underachievement in a gifted student, you can bet they didn't develop overnight, and they may take time to work through. Again, that work may not be purely linear. Conversations with the parents of underachieving gifted kids are very often filled with frustration. Patience and supportive determination go a long way here. This is another talk which can be helped by having a counselor or gifted coordinator present, again, preferably one who knows the student. Emotional intensity can be one of the most difficult areas of struggle for parents and for schools when working with gifted students, when working with any students, but when working with gifted students. The fact is that the brains of gifted students have much more wiring, as it were, and process information much more quickly than those of their same age counterparts. The fact that gifted students may have a higher level of emotional maturity does not mean, however, that their prefrontal cortex has suddenly matured more quickly as well. In fact, in gifted children, the prefrontal cortex often develops more slowly. Brain development is still a physical process, and the prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotional control, executive functions like planning, attention, problem solving, and organization, does not fully develop until usually the mid to late 20s. So we have students, children, who have faster processing and whose increased brain wiring means that much more information goes through their limbic system, which is their emotional center, than their same age peers. But the area of their brain which helps regulate emotional control is developing at the same rate or possibly even more slowly. What's up with that? If you work with or have a child who has intense emotional outbursts, I highly recommend watching Dr. Matt Zakreski's YouTube video, Riding Out the Storm, Managing Emotional Intensity in Gifted Children, published by the Colorado Association for Gifted and Talented. That title is in my resource notes, but I'm going to say it again. Riding Out the Storm, Managing Emotional Intensity in Gifted Children by Dr. Matt Zakreski. He offers some really great strategies for dealing with emotional outbursts as well as for preempting them in the first place. Too many to go over here. Watch the video. Finally, like emotional intensity, another area I'm going to talk about where you can really help parents is with overexcitability, OE. OE is not only found in gifted people, and not all gifted people struggle with OE. but it seems like there is a higher incidence of OE among the gifted population. Overexcitability is a term coined by Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski, who then called OE the tragic gift. As I talk about OE, if you think of any student or person you know, please look into the website www.tragicgift.com by Emma Nicholson, or the writings on overexcitability by Sharon Lind, or the writings on Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration by Linda Silverman, or Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration in general. Resources abound on this topic, so many that they may be overwhelming. So these are some fantastic places to start. So what is OE? Overexcitability has been identified in 5 areas, each with its own struggles. People with overexcitability may struggle with only one area or more than one. I'm going to quote these traits directly from tragicgift.com. Areas of OE are psychomotor, with its downsides of overcompetitiveness, compulsive behaviors such as fidgeting, pacing, or compulsive rapid speech, impulsive behaviors such as interrupting others while talking or risk-taking, nervous habits and tics like scratching, picking, or tapping, sleeplessness, or disrupted sleep patterns. Next is sensual OE, which can exhibit as sensitivity to pollution, smells, and chemicals, tactile sensitivity, particularly to clothes fabrics like wool, clothing tags, and seams in socks are common irritants. Light and sound sensitivity, almost sounds like autism or something, huh? Seeking attention with the sensation of feeling the external gaze. Not autism there. Craving pleasure or comfort from material items, hobbies, or even sexual activity. Substance abuse or eating disorders. Characteristics of sensual OE. Intellectual OE. You may recognize some of these traits in your gifted students, if you haven't already. Impatience with others who can't keep up. Obsessive focus on areas of interest. Workaholism. Nagging curiosity or need to consume excessive media, e.g., watching too much news. Rebellious, argumentative, or questioning authority. They don't have to be gifted for that, I know. Imaginative OE, daydreaming or almost alone in their own thoughts. Fear of the unknown. Paranoia or worst case scenario thinking. Vivid dreams and nightmares. Lack of focus. Easily distracted or easily bored. Emotional OE. Anxiety and depression. Extremes of emotion, rapid mood swings, or feeling too many emotions at once, loneliness, clinging to relationships or feeling continually out of place, strong memory of trauma, physical reactions to strong emotions like stomach aches, sweating and blushing, rapid heartbeat, panic attacks, timidity and shyness, or social anxiety. As you may have spotted, as I mentioned, many of these traits look a lot like ADHD, OCD, oppositional defiant disorder, autism, any number of conditions, Asperger's. Many of these medical conditions are dealt with by medication. Possibly medication is going to be helpful for some students. People who struggle with OE can be very vulnerable and can have no idea of how to deal with their intensities. Parents may be in real and desperate struggles to support their children. If you recognized any of your students or people you know or yourself in this list, again, there are some terrific resources to explore OE more deeply. I highly recommend tragicgift.com as a great place to start. Even knowing their struggle is real and that there are others out there dealing with this can be a great help to people struggling with OE. One brief note about medications, especially for ADHD. Obviously, we are not doctors, we're not clinicians, we are teachers. So we won't be saying, man, your kid should be on meds. But we can show parents written records of exact behaviors by their kids, preferably with any antecedents and careful tracking of patterns. And we can remind parents that all decisions have a side effect, medicating as well as not medicating. Medications are absolutely appropriate for some students and are not for others. At the end of the day, remember, most parents are just trying to do the best for their kids that they can. Thank you so much for joining me today. I've tried to give you points to make and resources to help you speak with the parents of gifted children. Hopefully, they will help you in your work with gifted students as well. If you want to discuss anything further, please reach out to me via email at dave@teacherdave.net. Teacher Dave saying goodbye for now.